I'm going to request help from Ashley with the Sequoia Park Zoo Foundation, who's working in the background to facilitate this whole talk. And if your connection to Zoom is dropped and you're unable to get back in, you can also watch and comment live on Facebook. And if you're having trouble connecting to Zoom, you might not be logged into your account. And we do require that participants are logged into a free Zoom account before clicking on the lecture link. And also you'll notice that we have our participants' cameras turned off and the audio muted automatically. And we would appreciate it if everyone would remain muted and with your videos turned off so that we can provide the best streaming experience for everyone. And then down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a chat button. We love chatting. So if you have any questions, you can ask them by clicking on that chat button. That's going to pop up a chat box where you can type in the question. And we will try to get to everyone's questions and answer them at the end of the lecture. We'll also monitor the Facebook Live comments and answer questions from there. So just feel free to submit them as you are thinking of them as the lecture is happening. And then finally, during our in-person lectures, we always pass the hat to collect donations for our zoo's conservation fund so that our zoo can continue doing this awesome conservation work all across the globe. And this year we're virtually passing the hat by sharing a link in our chat. So for those that are on Facebook, you can donate on our website at www.sequoiaparkzoo.net. So thanks everyone for prioritizing conservation and coming tonight. Joining us tonight is Dr. Michaela Gunther, who's introducing tonight's speaker. Dr. Gunther is a professor in the Department of Wildlife at Humboldt State University, whose research focuses on the behavioral ecology of mammals. And she has served on our Conservation Advisory Committee since its inception in 2011. And she organizes this lecture every year, and we're so thankful for all of her efforts and her passion for conservation. So I'm going to turn it on over to Michaela. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you to everyone who is here tonight. It is really my pleasure to be all of those things that Ruth just said. I thoroughly enjoy being a part of this conservation committee. I enjoy helping to organize these lecture series. I love my work at Humboldt State University with wildlife, and I'm really pleased that the community comes and enjoys these lecture series. And so welcome to coming tonight on a Wednesday night and hearing about our local wildlife. It really makes me happy to see so many people who are interested. And I'm also really pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, both as our last speaker in this series and also as a recent recipient of one of our grant awards. So while you were waiting for our lecture to start, you saw the photos going through, and Marie Martin has received some funding from the Sequoia Park Zoo to help with some of the research that she's going to talk about today. And also one of my, we share this interest in martens. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce Marie Martin, who works on martens. I'm sure she gets that a lot. Sorry, Marie.
No, first time, Michaela.
So Marie is a faculty research assistant at Oregon State University in the Institute for Natural Resources. She received her BS in wildlife ecology from the University of Maine and her MS in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So she moved progressively further west over time, out here in the Pacific Northwest now. Really exciting, her thesis, her master's thesis work was focused on implementing novel approaches to quantify the effects of landscape heterogeneity, so changes in the landscape, and scale on the movement patterns, space use, and energetics of Pacific martens, and that was out in northeastern California. Currently, she's working for the Institute for Natural Resources, she's based in Portland in Oregon, where she studies generally and broadly speaking the ecology of mammalian communities and their responses to changes in land use, climate, and wildfire regimes in the Western US. So I'm really excited to hear a lot about that work and see some great photos of the Pacific marten as Marie shares her story with us with her talk called Exploring the Behavior of Pacific Martens in Lassen National Forest in California. Thanks, Marie, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, super excited. Let me start sharing my screen here. All right. Can I get confirmation folks can see my screen?
Yes, that looks great.
Perfect. Awesome. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Michaela and Ruth and Ashley on the back end for introducing and hosting me. I'm really excited to be here and to chat about a species that's very special to me and to just connect with you all tonight. Hopefully we can all learn a little bit together. And at the very least, I promise, as Michaela mentioned, there will be lots of cute photos of martens. So hang tight for that. So as Michaela mentioned, I'm a research ecologist, and I've been super lucky to be a guest in many beautiful and dynamic landscapes for work and for play. And so as an ecologist, I'm really interested in thinking broadly about how animals interact with each other and with their environments. And so one of the broadest questions in ecology is just, where are animals and why are they there? I'm interested in some other questions as well, including how might animals interact with each other and how might their surroundings influence those interactions? How might animals' surroundings affect important demographic rates like reproduction or survival? How do an animal's surroundings affect individual processes like movement, behavior, or physiology? And particularly in contemporary ecosystems, how do forces like climate or landscape change alter animal distributions, as well as their movement and physiology? And so I've been lucky to think about these questions in the context of many species across the United States. But one group of species has always fascinated me, and that is, of course, martens. And so what is a marten? As a kid who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, I didn't learn about what a marten was until, as Michaela mentioned, I went to school in Maine. But martens are a small mammal that's a part of the mustelid family, which includes weasels, ferrets, badgers, and otters. And so martens are actually distributed across the globe, and there are a lot of species of martens and closely related animals like wolverines and fishers. But today's talk will focus on martens in Western North America, and in particular, as Michaela mentioned, in those northeastern mountains of California. And so martens are a really interesting and charismatic species and are of conservation concern throughout much of their range. Martens often occur in forested environments or places that have a lot of vegetation. And so even though they're small, as you can see this tiny marten next to all of these huge trees in the circle in red, martens are pretty amazing with their physical capacity for movement and activity. Martens can move long distances in pretty short amounts of time. It isn't unusual for an adult to move several kilometers per day, and juveniles can disperse distances of more than 100 kilometers before setting up a new home range. Because of these characteristics of their behavior and body size, the loss of forest or vegetation cover can lead to population declines. And in montane regions in the Western United States, their habitat is also typically covered by seasonal deep snowpack. And martens are really well adapted to dealing with deep snow. They have pretty large feet and really small bodies, so you could think of it almost as a set of snowshoes that allows them to float across the top of the snow and really move pretty efficiently through snow. Whereas larger predators that might occur in the same areas as martens, such as bobcats or coyotes, have pretty small feet and pretty heavy bodies. And so luckily for martens, these adaptations let them exploit high elevation, deep snow areas that other carnivores might not be able to access. Unfortunately, due to climate change and increasingly frequent droughts, snowpack is declining in the Western United States. So changes to snow characteristics and the duration of snow cover can alter carnivore communities, so releasing some of those larger predators into these high elevation areas, and increasing the amount of time that martens have to deal with competition and predation from larger predators. Because of their body shape and active lifestyle, martens also have really high energetic requirements. They have to balance their energy budget, so those daily energetic requirements, on an almost near daily basis to avoid starvation. So just as an example, that's equal to me having to eat about 33 bean and cheese burritos per day, which for me sounds awesome and is not the biggest deal because I have grocery stores down the street from me and I have a garden out back. But this is a pretty serious investment for a small predator that usually weighs between 1 and 2 pounds. And so because of their small body size and high activity levels, martens are also really at risk of predation or competition with larger carnivores. But in locations that have woody features and heterogeneous vegetation as pictured here, so thinking about down logs, nice shrub cover, martens have a much better chance of evading their predators. And so all of these aspects of marten ecology can interact to influence really important demographic rates like reproduction and survival that ultimately influence population persistence over time. And so martens have a really interesting reproductive cycle that takes place over the course of a human's calendar year. In the spring, martens give birth to small litters, typically 2 to 3 babies, with the mother doing the majority of feeding and raising of the offspring. In the summer, kits start to be a little more independent, and male martens start seeking out females to mate. Martens, like many other species, including bears, seals, and other mustelids, have a reproductive strategy called delayed implantation. So what this means is that after mating, the fertilized egg hangs out in utero, but doesn't implant in the uterus until the February of the following year. And so this allows martens to recover from stressful periods like mating and reproduction, survive through the winter, and then ultimately become pregnant in the spring, where additional resources like small mammals will become more active and more available to support that pregnancy. In the fall, juvenile martens start dispersing across the landscape to try and make it on their own, kind of like humans moving out or going to college. They're trying to set up their own home range and figure out how to survive by themselves. And adults in the fall start settling into non-reproductive behaviors and hanging out by themselves. In the winter, most individuals are just doing what they can to survive, chilling out in cavities in trees or in below snow burrows, as is pictured here, and acquiring prey to support expenditures in what can sometimes be harsh conditions, thinking about snow cover and cold temperatures. And so even though the reproductive cycle kind of aligns with these 4 distinct periods, in montane areas, we often split seasons for martens into 2 biological periods, thinking about snow-free seasons, which aligns with the spring and summer months when martens are reproducing, raising their offspring, finding mates, and avoiding predators and competitors, versus the snow-covered season, where martens are mostly independent, trying to acquire food and avoid harsh conditions, but aren't as stressed by competition or predation as those predators or competitors might not be as common at those high elevations where deep snow precludes their presence. And so even with an expensive lifestyle, martens are pretty amazing and bold carnivores. And so I think this video from the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation illustrates this perfectly. So here we have a marten doing what martens do, trying to find calories and going to town on a random piece of meat that was used to bait a camera for wildlife research. And so things get really exciting in a couple of seconds here when a goshawk, this large avian predator, shows up and startles the marten. And so just for context, goshawks will totally kill a marten and will totally eat a marten if it comes down to it, particularly if the marten is messing with their nest or trying to take prey. And yet, a few seconds later, the marten starts going to town on the piece of bait again, and then even tries to scare off the goshawk, which we have going in slow motion here right now, which is just totally incredible. And I feel like just captures the frenetic energy of martens, which is just like, regardless of how small they are, regardless of how many things will kill them or eat them, they are just so hungry, you might even say hangry, and they really just need to find some food to make it to the next day. And so with that background about marten ecology, hopefully I've demonstrated why they're such an interesting and fun species to study or think about. Martens are super sensitive to changes in forest structure and climate. They have super high metabolic rates that make them sensitive to starvation. Their small body size means they're at risk of being killed by other carnivores or being outcompeted by larger animals. And their boldness and need to meet their energetic requirements means that they sometimes engage in risky behaviors because at the end of the day, getting those calories is worth interacting with a predator or a competitor. And so even though we know a lot about Marten ecology, there are definitely still some gaps in knowledge that we were excited and hopeful to address through a few broad questions. So first, just kind of broadly understanding, where are martens? What do they use? And how might things like the presence of snow affect their use of resources? Second, thinking about how at a finer scale, changes in landscape structure or forest structure could affect marten behavior and in turn, physiology. So again, thinking about those important physiological outcomes like energetic expenditures. And finally, how might those aspects of marten behavior and ecology interact to affect important demographic outcomes like survival and mortality? And so starting at this broadest scale, thinking about just where are martens? And so martens are a pretty cryptic species who, as we've discussed previously, can move over really large areas. So it can be tough to understand where they occur and why they're occurring there. But figuring this out can help us understand why martens are there and how their populations might persist over time. Luckily, newer technologies like GPS collars allow us to collect many locations and track these animals explicitly through time and space. And so similarly to figuring out where martens are, it can be tough for us to know what martens are doing without knowing where they occur. But thankfully, those GPS collars provide us with explicit information about where martens are and when they're there. So GPS collars are programmed to take locations just like you might drop a pin on a map. Once we retrieve a GPS collar, we can map out those locations and determine where martens were and what they were up to. So looking at this photo, you can maybe see that these dots and locations are kind of spread out over space, but once you start digging into what's going on behind the dots, you might see a pattern, which is a lot of these dots are overlapping with these green areas, which represent vegetated areas. And so this could suggest that martens are typically occurring in or using vegetated areas. And when we compare this to what's more broadly available across the landscape, including these roads and these more open areas that might be natural openings like a meadow or human-made openings like an old woodlot, we can start to do something, calculate something called resource selection. And this shows us what martens are using versus what's available on the landscape. And this can let us figure out whether martens prefer certain features or conditions. And so revisiting those two biological seasons, it might make sense that martens would select or respond to different features in different seasons. So during those snow-covered months when martens are mostly independent, they're typically trying to acquire food and avoid harsh conditions. But competitors and predators aren't as common or as much of a concern in those snow-covered months. So martens might not be as sensitive or needing of those forest features that allow them to evade predators. During snow-free months, which align with spring and summer, when martens are reproducing, raising their offspring, finding mates, and avoiding predators and competitors, those woody forest features might then become more important. And so to think about what martens are using, we can incorporate measurements of the environment martens occur in. So we can think about things like the number of trees or density of vegetation, the depth of snow, how the elevation of where martens are occurring, or how rugged the landscape they're occurring in is, how open a forest is, or whether it's been disturbed by management or fire, and the availability of features like cavities that allow martens to rest, reproduce, or evade predators. And so digging into some of these results, I'll just kind of explain this. So negative on the left side of this figure means that martens are typically avoiding these features or are less likely to use them. And positive on the right means that martens are selecting for or more likely to use those features. And so during snow-free months, martens were typically avoiding small trees, using areas closer to roads, so avoiding those areas further from roads, and avoiding areas that had really steep slopes. Whereas on the other side, martens were typically selecting for forest patches that had large trees, forest patches in higher elevation areas, and areas that had that nice heterogeneous forest cover. So variation in canopy cover and and the age of stands. And so digging into what this might mean biologically, so you might think that for a forest associated species, trees are great, but not all forests are equal. And so this picture might represent a younger stand that's the result of timber management. So you can see a lot of these trees are the same size, and there's not really a lot of shrubs or large logs on the ground. And so that variation in the size of trees and the availability of woody features not only ensures that martens can use that stand now, but also make sure that over time, as some of those trees start dying and other trees start growing, we have a resilient and regenerating forest that will support martens. And so one result that might seem a little bit counterintuitive is that we typically found martens were using areas closer to roads. But this could be the artifact of a few things. For example, on a day when we have 40 to 50 trap locations out, and our ultimate goal is to make sure that every trap gets checked, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of putting traps very far from roads. So a lot of our trapping locations are concentrated around roads, and we might be more likely to catch animals that are hanging out around these roads. On the flip side, as you can see by some of these fainter lines on this map, oftentimes Forest Service roads aren't well maintained. So the difference between a Forest Service road and a functional highway would be like the difference between a treadmill in your local gym and the Pacific Crest Trail, where yes, absolutely, you're a little bit more exposed to risk by predation or by exposure to humans, but at the same time, this is very different than a marten running along the I-5. And so thinking about what martens do use, there were definitely some unsurprising results, which sometimes is a good thing, in this snow-free season. And so especially thinking about martens selecting for stands that have big old trees. And so I have a red circle around a marten here, which is taking a little nap on this broken branch. This is the perfect resting location for a marten in a snow-free month. It's a little hot, they're hanging out on this branch. This way they're avoiding all those terrestrial predators like bobcats and coyotes, while also conserving some of that energy that's super important for them in their day-to-day activities. And then thinking about that variability and heterogeneity. So variation in canopy cover can be a proxy for vegetation heterogeneity. So in here, we have some larger, older trees, as well as some smaller, younger trees, and not pictured here, but absolutely some shrub cover and smaller trees on the ground that can support martens foraging as well as predator escape behaviors. And so digging into snow-covered resource selection, we definitely saw some different patterns of what martens were doing and using on the landscape. And perhaps most surprisingly is that there was actually a negative relationship with big trees, where martens seemed to be selecting against or just generally not using areas that had big trees, which we can dig into a little bit more in a second. On the positive side, martens were selecting for or using dense vegetation and rugged areas on the landscape. And so thinking about these results, here's an example of a winter rest site, which I think most could argue is a big tree. But it's always important for us as scientists to remind ourselves that your analysis doesn't always capture a relationship or response at every scale. So these resource selections that we ran were really helpful at broader scales. So thinking about what a marten is using across their home range, across several weeks, and is better at detecting general trends of behavior and use. But unfortunately, sometimes these finer scale responses, such as using a big tree for a rest site, can be washed out in those results. It definitely doesn't mean that big trees aren't important, but it also means that as martens are moving around the landscape in winter, they might not be as concerned about finding a big tree to hang out in to avoid a predator or take a nap. So what martens were selecting for, though, also definitely makes sense. These rugged areas are associated with deep snow, which, as we know from talking earlier, martens are well suited and well adapted to move through. So these rugged areas often have deeper snow than the general landscape, And this means that martens can go about their daily activities without having to worry so much about encountering a bobcat or a coyote. They also selected for denser forest stands. And so these dense stands kind of have this unique and exciting property, which the Sequoia Park Zoo actually supported, as Michaela mentioned at the beginning of the talk, a little side project that we were really excited to dig into. And what we found was these dense forest stands and dense vegetation actually provide an insulative property. So during the summer months, dense vegetation tends to be a little bit cooler than the surrounding environment. Whereas in the winter months, as pictured here, those dense vegetation stands tend to be a little bit warmer than the surrounding environment. And so for an animal that's almost virtually always on the verge of starvation, any degree that you can use to spare a few calories seems like it's super important. And then another thing that these dense vegetation stands can provide is these subnivean or below snow burrows. So as we mentioned in the introduction, in the winter, martens will often use these below snow burrows and cavities that are created by shrubs and dense vegetation on the ground. So you can think of it as kind of similar to an igloo where, maybe you don't associate snow with being cozy and warm. But by the time you have a nice cavity in that snow and then a warm body hanging out in that cavity, it can really help warm up a marten on a cold day. And so again, resource selection was super helpful to consider broader patterns of marten behavior and what they were using across the landscape. But we were still curious about how a marten's environment could affect their behavior and physiology at a finer scale, which aligned really well with our second research interest, which is thinking about whether landscape or forest structure can affect marten behavior, energetics, and body condition. And so energetics are a really important part of ecology. Metabolism is the currency of life, and we all need to eat and move and expend energy in order to keep living. And so overall, energetic expenditures of wild mammals can be tied to things like life stage, so whether they're reproductive or not reproductive, their habitat or environmental surroundings, their activity and movement, their lifestyle, so thinking about whether they're a predator or a prey, and ultimately an animal's energetics, as well as the resources they use across a landscape, delineate where they might occur in space and time. And so when we think about researching energetics, those projects often look like this, collecting highly precise data in a laboratory setting where you can minimize variation. We actually do this a lot with human energetics research. So if you've ever seen pictures or commercials of athletes, this is a really effective way for us to look at metabolic condition, VO2, and overall output of a human. And so the only issue with lab setting ecology research is that we know animals don't exist in a vacuum. Relationships between physiology, environmental conditions, and movement and behavior can be really complex. And so we wanted to understand how marten energetics might manifest in a free-ranging system, so those natural conditions that martens are interacting with on the day-to-day. And so to do this, we used a doubly labeled water technique, which allows us to estimate metabolic rate of a free-ranging animal. So in this example, a wild marten. And so to complete the doubly labeled water method, we capture an animal and then take a background blood sample. And so as we all learned kind of in grade school, everyone, including martens, humans, mammals, we all have water in our body. And so that background blood sample allows us to look at the signature of the water in their blood. So depending on where you occur, like across the globe, the oxygen atoms in your blood water actually have a unique signature, and that's called an isotope. And so to look at marten energetics, we can then inject them with laboratory grade doubly labeled water. And so all this means is that that water has a unique hydrogen and oxygen isotope. And so we collect a blood sample after we've administered the doubly labeled water that then tells us what their adjusted isotope level is. We then release the marten and they go about their daily activities, all the while respirating, creating carbon dioxide, as well as urinating and defecating and releasing some of that water from their body. And so when we ultimately catch them a few days to a week later, we can take a final blood sample, and then we can measure those hydrogen and oxygen atoms left in their blood. And so the amount of isotope that's left their system allows us to calculate their metabolic rate, which is super amazing and cool. And I had no idea about this technique before I did my master's, and I just think is a really interesting and cool way to look at animal energetics in a free-ranging landscape. And so we combined doubly labeled water and GPS collars to think about how movement might explain variation in energetic expenditures. So we measured things like metabolic rate, how quickly martens were moving, as well as the environmental characteristics they were moving through. So thinking about forest structure and their body condition. And so what we found, maybe not surprising, particularly considering those photos of animals on treadmills, is movement characteristics can explain variation in metabolism. And in particular, as martens started to move more often and more quickly, their metabolic rates increased. What was really exciting, though, was that we found that as martens used more open areas, as pictured here, they tended to move more quickly, more often, and more erratically. And this in turn led to increased expenditures, so more calories burned per day. And so for the individuals that use the highest proportion of open areas per day, we found that this was equivalent to about a 10% increase in metabolism, or having to acquire an extra mouse per day to avoid starvation. Which again, might not seem like a lot to us, but for a highly active mammal moving through risky areas, who's almost always on the verge of starvation, that extra 10% of calories required to survive could have serious health and population implications. And so we also found that as martens moved through more open areas, their body condition decreased. And so what that means is that they tended to be skinnier or more emaciated than we might expect for a marten of their size. And so for animals that can survive off fat stores, this might not be a big deal. But once again, for an animal that can starve within a couple days, this is a huge deal. And any additional stress to body condition could have serious implications for survival, as well as for expensive activities like reproduction. And so the causes of decreased body condition might once again have to do with changes in behavior and movement. Forests with lots of logs, shrubs, and varying forest cover, as pictured on the right, allow martens to move more slowly, sinuously, exploring the nooks and crannies to find prey. And even though predators also occur in these forested areas, those nooks and crannies provide a lower stress environment with lots of opportunities for martens to escape from predators while acquiring plenty of prey. And so in a perfect world, I imagine that a marten would have access to as much prey, as many squirrels and chipmunks and heterogeneous forest cover as they want. But in reality, they have to deal with the risk of predation from a suite of predators, including avian predators, nocturnal predators, diurnal predators, and terrestrial predators. And even more frequently, the reality is that they probably have to deal with predation risk and stressful environmental conditions at the same time. And so for our final topic of interest, we were really curious about trying to determine how the ecology of martens and, including these periods of increased expenditure or stress could potentially affect important demographic outcomes like survival or mortality. And so once again, starting broad, we were just really curious about what causes mortality of martens. And so we tracked radio collared animals using VHF collars as well as those GPS collars to see where they were and when they died. And so both of these types of collars are programmed to give off a unique signal once the collar is still, so no longer moving for a certain amount of time. Once we get that signal, we go to investigate and try to track down the collar and or the marten. And so once we find a carcass, we can start our marten crime scene investigation, documenting things like location, so the conditions of where the marten was found, as well as looking for evidence of the predator. So, thinking of things like scat, hair, and feathers. And we can also measure teeth and talon marks, which can provide a little bit more evidence or clarity about who might have killed our marten. So thinking about, the difference in size between the teeth of a cougar versus a bobcat versus a coyote. some of these measurements might be really different. And so taking a measurement of tooth size could give a little bit of illumination about who might have killed the marten. But we also took DNA swabs that we could analyze in a clinical setting for a little bit more certainty about who might have killed the marten. And so thanks to the Integral Ecology Research Center and our collaborators, Murad Gabriel and Greta Wengert, they did necropsies and determined causes of death, including predator identity, and then also some co-occurring conditions that might have caused morbidity. And so just a quick forewarning, if anyone doesn't like blood or internal organs, you might want to glance away for a minute, and I'll let you know once the slide no longer features the inside of a marten. But this is super cool because these necropsies can allow us to validate whether there's evidence of predation, such as hemorrhaging pictured here, or whether there's evidence of scavenging, where you would expect that a live animal that's hit by a predator, whether it's their teeth or their talons, would bruise and cause this clotting and discoloration in the tissue. Whereas an animal that was already dead when a predator stumbled upon it probably wouldn't have any of that bruising because their blood is no longer flowing and there's not going to be any hemorrhaging when a predator stumbles on the carcass. So for any folks who don't like blood, we are in the clear. And so zooming back out, thinking about more generally, what might explain variation in those survival patterns? So it's really important to know who is killing the martens, but also how that might play out over time and how that might affect population persistence. And so revisiting this graph, I think, for us thinking about what might influence survival, we keep coming back to these really important energetic pinch points where you are all very familiar with this graph now and know that martens have really different behaviors depending on their sex, so kind of their role in the social structure and reproduction structure of the population, but then also depending on the time of year, thinking about important energetic investments like reproduction or mating. And so when thinking about survival patterns more broadly, we considered the sex of the individual as well as the time that they died to account for these potentially important variation in demographic responses. And so thanks to those clinical and field assessments, we found that predation was the most common cause of death for martens in this study area. And DNA tests showed that bobcats turned up as the most frequent predator when carcasses were available for testing. Clinical methods also revealed a somewhat disconcerting but totally interesting finding, which is that this was the first known time that a marten had died due to toxicosis from anticoagulant rodenticide exposure. And so anticoagulant rodenticides are a poison or family of poisons that's really aimed at personal and commercial use to remove mice and rats and other rodents who might be pests around the home or around a business. And so while in California, these were recently banned, much of our data was collected before 2020 when this rodenticide ban was implemented. And these rodenticides remain legal in many other parts of the United States and the globe. And so while this work took place in relatively rural or, not habituated areas, thinking about national forest land, this probably wasn't a case of a marten eating prey that had visited someone's home, but more likely an effect of illegal cannabis production, where the goal of illegal cannabis grows is really to produce as much product as they can. And so they often use these rodenticides to minimize the effects of pests. So once again, thinking about squirrels, chipmunks, mice, voles, rats, and their likelihood to eat vegetation. And so typically we associate the elevations that these illegal cannabis grows occur at lower elevations. So often they overlap with where spotted owls or fishers might occur. And so this was really interesting and also, kind of illuminating that we need to think more broadly about how rodenticides used for illegal cannabis grows, or just more broadly in general, might affect wildlife, but also humans in the long term. And so zooming back out to thinking about factors that might explain variation in survival, we did find that there were important sex-specific difference in survival patterns. So survival of females was lowest in February and April, and these months overlap entirely with pregnancy and parturition. So parturition is giving birth. And once again, maybe this isn't surprising, but it's also interesting and exciting to show that these really energetically stressful and costly times of the year can be, deadly for a female who's trying to raise her kids. And then ultimately, the loss of a reproductive female impacts the next generation due to those abandoned kits if she is predated or dies from another cause. We also found that survival of males was lowest during July and August, which also overlaps with the mating season, which once again might not be that surprising given males have to move much longer distances and are more likely to run into a predator or face the risk of starvation, but again has really important implications for the cost of reproduction for these energetically sensitive animals. And so just to do a quick recap, thinking broadly at that resource selection scale, we found that there were definitely differences in what martens were using between snow-free and snow-covered months. Where in the snow-free periods, those big trees, heterogeneous vegetation, and closed canopies were really important places for martens to hang out and move around the landscape, versus snow-covered periods where rugged topography and dense vegetation that might be associated with accumulating snow, more favorable microclimates, and just generally chilling out seem to be preferable. And once again, this supports the idea that martens require different things depending on the season. For those snow-free months, once again, martens are giving birth, they're raising kits, they're mating with each other, and they're trying to avoid predators and competitors while they do all of these reproductive activities, versus during a snow-covered period, where it's certainly energetically stressful due to low temperatures and exposure, but generally they're most concerned with acquiring prey and minimizing the stress of harsh conditions. And so importantly, and something that we maybe didn't look at quantitatively here, but we think that the loss of snow could potentially impact these patterns of resource selection, where forest characteristics in those months that we might consider snow covered, so thinking about winters, but in a drought period when there isn't snow, forest characteristics might be increasingly important for supporting martens and ensuring their persistence over time. Thinking about finer scale movement and energetics, we found that perhaps unsurprisingly, but really excitingly, movement, environment, and metabolism are absolutely linked together. And so when there are changes to a landscape, there's definitely consequences for the behavior and physiology of animals that are occurring in that landscape. We found that changes in forest structure could influence marten behavior, and once again, these have consequences for their health and persistence. And once again, the loss of snow or complex vegetation could exacerbate the energetic consequences of change. And so zooming in to patterns of mortality and survival, we found that predation was the leading source of mortality for martens in California. And this actually holds true across North America in populations that aren't trapped. But we considered whether, something like forest management practices, so trying to retain that heterogeneous forest cover, could potentially decrease predation risk. I think this would be a really exciting next avenue or venture of research. We found that survival decreased during reproductive periods, and this might be due to those increased expenditures and activity levels that ultimately lead to increased predation risk. And we also found that anticoagulant rodenticides might be an emerging or novel stressor for martens. And given the implications of these ARs, which is that at worst, an animal dies, but it is not a quick death. And, these rodenticides and poisons can affect any mammal. So thinking about the neurological effects and the sublethal effects, so effects that happen before or leading up to a death, could absolutely affect other mammals, including humans. And so, think about why does this all matter? And, I think it's hard to ignore the fact that, due to drought, climate change, and centuries of management focused on economics instead of ecology, wildfires in the Pacific states are increasing in severity, frequency, and size. And, the most obvious effects of this is forest loss, but, pretty insidious effects and important implications for humans and wildlife together. And the loss of forests and, the health effects of these severe wildfires have lasting effects on ecosystems and communities. And once again, thinking about humans, this dumpster diving cutie demonstrates the effects of contemporary human activities on carnivores and other animals, including martens. And so, thinking about just a single action we do, which is introducing new sources of food to wild animals. This is hilarious to me that we have a dumpster diving marten eating a cookie, and really speaks to marten's flexibility and resilience. But unfortunately, these cookies in a dumpster at a ski resort probably provide little nutrition and might make them bolder and might make them more likely to engage in riskier behaviors. And, a lot of amazing researchers have observed this in larger carnivores like coyotes and bobcats. And so, thinking about the effects of human behavior and, particularly, colonial like effects on wildlife, I think is a super important path forward. And so, even though Pacific martens in northeastern California aren't endangered or threatened, a lot of our findings could also apply to the state endangered and federally threatened Humboldt marten on the coast of California, or even more broadly to many other endangered and threatened species in California and elsewhere. And, I think a goal moving forward is to think about, obviously these species that we're passionate about. Of course, I love martens and care about martens, but all of these species have significant ecological, cultural, and just implicit value. The fact that they exist is valuable. And so moving forward, it might take some creative working to think about how we can balance the needs of humans and making sure that humans are safe and healthy, as well as making sure that wildlife and wild places are safe and healthy, and addressing these contemporary issues to make sure that they persist over time. And so with that, I would love to acknowledge a lot of people, including my old master's advisor and committee members, and special shout out to Katie Moriarty, who's my previous supervisor and supported so much of this work. And, some of this work actually stems back to her PhD too. So I'm really excited to be a part of this team and be able to just kind of share a little bit of the lifestyle of martens with all of you today, and some of the exciting stuff that I've been very lucky to participate in. And a whole suite of people supported this work, but obviously a special shout out goes to Sequoia Park Zoo. As Michaela mentioned, I received that small grant for some of the temperature research looking at how microclimates vary. And that was super exciting because I received it actually as a technician, and that really helped me start thinking about questions in ecology that excite me, and actually helped lead up to me starting my master's on this research. And so, yeah, I can't thank you all enough for hanging out and hanging in there and hopefully enjoying some cute marten pictures. So of course I have one more for you. Just want to thank you, and of course open it up for questions. And if people have to jet or don't feel comfortable asking questions right now, please feel free to email me at this email address. But otherwise, yeah, excited to chat with folks who have any questions.
Thanks so much, Marie. We are all eager to jump in with all sorts of questions about these amazing animals.
Awesome.
So I will share questions from our Zoom chat and Facebook Live comments, and then we'll keep checking for any new questions that are submitted. And as a reminder, the lecture is sponsored by Papa and Barkley, and we just want to give them a big thanks. They've been wonderful in making this happen virtually this year, so yay. And also we'll paste that link to donate to the Conservation Fund in our chat too. So Marie, when you had up the map that was showing the GPS location of the martens to show that habitat type usage, Sherman wanted to know how many days did all of those dots represent?
That's a great question, Sherman. So even though this is like amazing technology, it definitely is not without its limitations. So martens weigh, 1 to 2 pounds, so 500 to 1400 grams. And so the battery on those GPS collars is not really meant to last a long time. And so we were collecting really fine scale data. So at a 5-minute fixed interval, whenever the martens were active. So that could last anywhere from, 3 to maybe 14 days maximum. So yeah, it's definitely representative of a shorter period of time. But my previous supervisor, I mentioned, Katie, did show in some research that actually martens tend to circumnavigate their home range in about 3 to 7 days. So luckily for us, that actually lines up perfectly with the life of those GPS batteries. But yeah, I'm super excited. The technology is ever improving, and yeah, hopefully someday we'll be able to have the cool GPS collars that everyone who studies elk and larger carnivores does, where they just open up their laptop and log in and see all the locations. But for now, we have to go out and catch the marten again to get those data back.
Okay, and Anne asks, do martens eat amphibians?
Oh, that is a great question. I don't know, but I would not be surprised if they did. I think martens are so hangry that like anything that's remotely edible or annoys them that they encounter on the landscape, they'll eat. Like we see wasps actually turn up a lot in their scat. And I don't think it's because wasps are nutritious. I think it's because they get really annoyed when a wasp is flying around their face. And so they just reach out and grab it. But yeah, that's a great question and one that I don't necessarily know.
And Sherman asks, how do you define what a normal weight is for a marten, perhaps by season? So what is the baseline weight?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we came up, or well, really we followed some methods that previous researchers who have looked at animal energetics and body condition have looked at. And so, you can think of it as almost like a BMI type of thing, but really we just plot weight versus body length against each other on an axis and look at the relationship between those. And then we see how far those animals deviate from that relationship. So we would expect in general, most animals in this population would fall along this line, like this relationship. So any animal that's below that line might be underweight, or above that line is overweight, which for a marten, being overweight is great. Like, take all the somatic stores and adipose tissue you can, because you never know when your next meal is coming up. And yeah, I mean, we love martens that have lots of energy and are not going to starve. So.
And Guy asks, what do the martens sound like?
Oh man, I actually wish that I had this video that Katie had, but they are feisty. They're very fierce. And an old college professor of mine at UMaine said that she thought, pound for pound, martens were the scariest animal that you could encounter, because once again, they're pretty much always on the verge of starving and they never know when they're going to encounter another predator. So they, if you walk up on a trap on an animal in there, they're going to let you know most of the time that they're hanging out in that trap. And so it's our job to respectfully, quietly do things quickly and then make sure that the loud and feisty martens get back out onto the landscape.
Sarah asks, have you looked at the effects of the loss of snow on increased competition with fishers?
Oh, that is such a good question. And so I have not personally. I do know there was a fisher translocation that occurred around kind of Chico area, the Sterling reintroduction of fishers. And we actually started to get some of those fishers turning up in the Lassen. And I think that would be an awesome line of research. I do know there's a couple of papers out of Canada, one that looked at local trapping records. So relating that to changes in climate, where trappers seem to be getting more fishers within the last couple of decades and less martens in areas where there's less snow. There's also a lot of important ecological or indigenous knowledge about the ecology of fishers and martens. I went to school in Madison, so thinking about Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, those folks have been observing the association of martens with deeper snow and fissures, certainly with snow, but less deep snow, over generations. So yeah, I personally haven't, but it's totally something that other folks have looked at and is absolutely an important part of the interactions between those species.
Very cool. We have some information from Katie Moriarty. A follow-up to Anne's question about amphibians in the diet.
Awesome.
Says we have DNA evidence that martens have eaten frogs and lizards.
There you go.
So,
Yeah. Again, it's like
on here tonight.
it's like me, at a snack room when we still had those, like a break room where it's like, oh, the leftover Tootsie Rolls, like I really don't want a Tootsie Roll, but I am super hungry right now, so I'm going to eat the Tootsie Roll, even if it's not necessarily what I wanted to eat. Yeah.
Yep. Sarah also asked, did you incorporate live trapping and camera trap data into the resource selection function?
I did not, and I think that could be really interesting to really capturing, some of those like broader scale relationships. So, we have to account, obviously, there's a lot of correlation in GPS data. So when it's collected so frequently, you really have to account more for like what's available on the landscape around those locations. But I think that cameras and, some live capture data can be really helpful for like population level and like species distribution level relationships with their surroundings, for sure.
And then we're getting a lot of comments from Sherry and Frank. What a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining me. Yeah, I'm happy to, be here and just, obviously I love martens and I could probably talk all of your ears off forever about them. So I'm just excited to be here.
Janelle asked, can you talk a little bit about marten nesting ecology, like nest site selection, how frequently they move between dens, why they move, and things like that?
Yeah, totally. So some really cool research that came out from one of my old coworkers and collaborators, Matt Delheimer and Katie Moriarty, of course, looked at marten denning behavior. And so often they'll pick these trees, if I'm remembering correctly, which I'm sure Katie can fill into, with cavities that have smaller openings. So male martens, if they do think that those offspring aren't theirs, will do infanticide sometimes, just like a lot of wild animals do. So obviously, the best thing is to have your genes persist over time. So if a male marten thinks that the offspring are not his, he might kill the kits. But so when a female selects a tree that has a really tiny cavity, only she can get through, and that bigger male can't come in and investigate the situation. I think typically, like we would see female martens move maybe once or twice once they had kits, at least in those earlier stages. So thinking about when the kits are still really dependent on mom and when she's moving them around, when they can't really open their eyes or hunt on their own. But we would often get pictures on camera where the kids around June and July would start doing their own thing. So, mom might be leaving them for, a couple hours at a time to go get some snacks, and they would start playing with their siblings and start, trying to hunt a little bit on their own. But really, I think that the moving is dictated probably by the size of the cavity, as well as like the size of the offspring. So I think one big thing is that they often move once the cavity starts to fill up with scat, so poop and excreta, so like urine, as well as parasites. So mom wants to make sure those kits stay healthy and stay clean. So especially in those early stages where the kids are just like eating and pooping and not doing much else, just like all babies do, mom has to move them to a new location where it's nice and clean and they can grow up nice and healthy and well. But
yeah. Sean says, great talk. Wondering how much prey diversity and availability in open compared to more forest areas might also drive the movement patterns and body conditions observed.
Yeah, that is a super good question. And so that was something that Katie and I always wanted to look at, but we never really got around to. particularly because you might actually expect that some of those open areas might have more rodent species. There's a lot of grasses and forbs in those open areas. And so really a lot of like nutrition for a small herbivore or granivore. But like it would be a cool ecological experiment, because if you see that even though there's more prey in those open areas, if a marten is still stressed out and like showing that decreased body condition when they're using those open areas, it might suggest that it's not necessarily just whether or not prey are available, but also how the animal behaves and perceives risk in that landscape. So there's a lot of really cool experimental research thinking about the landscape of fear. So, you know, are the calories worth my perceived risk of moving through this opening? But yeah, I think that's a super great question. And again, would be a really cool line of questioning moving forward.
Yeah. Katie has some more data to throw at us too.
Perfect. See,
She,
yeah,
I think,
go
is
talk.
responding to the co-occurrence of Fisher and Marten, and says, as of this week, 31% Fisher at camera stations, and Martens are at 37% of the camera stations. So, and then she also says, times are changing. There are 83 cameras during the 2019-2020 season, I assume.
Exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, exciting
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Matthew says, I assume your research was done in the Lassen area where the Sierra subspecies is the main version. What are the distinguishing features of this subspecies? I saw one in Lassen National Park in 2015 that was much lighter brown than ones I've seen in Canada or Alaska. So is this subspecies rare, like the Humboldt marten?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so technically they aren't rare, but that doesn't mean they're not special. I love them so much. But I also noticed the same thing. So I know a lot of folks who do research on American martens in the Midwest. And it seems like a lot of those individuals, as well as the individuals up in Canada, so in those boreal environments, tend to be a little bit darker. So I don't know if it's true or if it's just anecdotal, but it kind of makes me think of like California black bears, where you get those beautiful blonde and cinnamon individuals, as well as some darker individuals. But I don't know if it's just like a phenotype, so a little bit of like individual variation. But most of the martens I've seen kind of looks like this fella here, M39 on this question slide, where they have this lighter brown color, and then the really bold orange throat patch and chest patches. But we definitely had the occasional individual who is darker brown, but on the whole, they seem to be a little bit lighter than some of the like northerly or easterly individuals.
And Danielle asks, what would you say is the best way for a student like myself to participate or help with this issue?
That's a great question, Danielle. And yeah, I think persistence is always key. So when I started working for Katie, I emailed her, and my email sent as a draft that was unfinished. And Katie still responded to my email. So, you know, maybe send a complete email with a resume and make sure that your Gmail isn't just automatically sending things after a certain amount of time. But it's totally okay and reasonable to reach out to people, like do a cold contact and email people to see if they have anything available. And even if they don't, they know your name now. And so if you ever apply for a position once they do have funding available, they know that you're excited and interested in the research. I think it's a really hard time for like ecology, just like funding and stuff. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities out there. I would also say, especially as like, you know, if you're an undergraduate or don't have experience with carnivores yet, it's totally okay to work with a species that's not a carnivore before you start, you know, reaching out to and working with carnivore ecologists or carnivore projects. My first field job was looking at fisheries ecology in Southern Illinois. And then I did a lot of small mammal trapping, some entomology work. So really, I think that, you know, one of the best things you can do is just be excited and curious and, you know, generally enthusiastic about getting experience and thinking about the natural world. So yeah, and also feel free to email me if anything comes up or if you have any more questions. I'd be happy to chat.
Oh, thanks, Marie. That's a great answer. Very inspiring. Jessica wanted to say thanks. This was great, super interesting to learn. Sarah also says, thank you, very interesting work. We've got lots of folks excited about Martens tonight.
Yes, if they're my only job is to convince everyone that Martens are awesome. So feel like my job here is done. So yeah, very excited.
Been successful. And it is, I think those are all of our questions. Hopefully I didn't miss any, but it's a little bit after 8, so we're going to wrap it up.
Awesome.
Thank you again for joining us tonight, Marie, and sharing about these fascinating mustelids. So good luck with all your future work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this has been a pleasure. And yeah, I'm always excited to, the Martens are the real superstars here. So yeah, all credit goes to them.
Yes, thank you. And this was the last lecture in this season's conservation series. We will be back in the fall. We can't know if that will be in person or virtual at this point, but we will make sure to let everybody know. I just want to thank all of the people who made this lecture series possible, especially our Conservation Advisory Committee, Ashley Mobley, who's the Director of Marketing and Events with Sequoia Park Zoo Foundation and runs all these lectures behind the scenes. She does a ton of work and we really appreciate that. Gretchen Ziegler, who's the Sequoia Park Zoo Director, and Lee Pierre Oker, who's the Executive Director of the Sequoia Park Zoo Foundation. And a huge thanks to our community for always being so involved in this lecture series every year and wanting to learn about and advocate for the conservation of wildlife. Your participation in this year's lecture series was just such a joy during a time that has been really tough. So thank you, and we can't wait for next year's series and hope to see you at the zoo soon. So thanks, everybody.